The station was a coffin of silence, not the kind that comforted, but the kind that pressed, heavy and unforgiving. Midnight in 2025 stretched across a platform empty of trains and people and meaning. The fluorescent lights flickered as if they were suffocating, casting ragged shadows across the cracked tiles. There was a smell in the air, a sharp metallic smell, like burnt plastic or worse. It wasn't the usual damp rot of this place. Thomas Gray, a clerk with 20 years of night shifts etched into his arms, hunched behind the counter, staring at a screen that hadn't refreshed in hours. Night shifts were a slow bleed, sticky and endless, and they always brought up thoughts he'd rather leave buried. A sound cut through the silence, a faint tapping like someone tapping on glass. Thomas frowned, his head snapping up. The tapping came again, soft but insistent, though the windows showed only blackness. He stood, his chair creaking beneath him, and shuffled toward the door. The tapping came again, unsourced, taunting. He looked around the platform, dead, just scraps of debris sliding in the wind. Then he saw it, the suitcase, standing by the entrance. Alone, motionless, as if it had been tossed in the air while he was blinking. It was old, the leather worn, and cracked at the seams, but the lock gleamed, stubborn, guarding what was inside. Thomas froze. No one left luggage in this backwater town. People didn't even drive through it. The suitcase seemed foreign, out of place, as if it had fallen out of another story. He stepped closer, inhaling the bitter, burnt smell that came from the suitcase. His pulse quickened, not from the cold, but from something crawling under his skin. He glanced around. The station was empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling of invisible eyes. Rough fingers touched the lock. The click boomed in the empty air, loud as a gunshot. The lid groaned as it opened and Thomas stopped breathing. Inside were letters, dozens, maybe more, neatly folded in faded envelopes, tied with thin string. On each was a scribble, the ink faded but still sharp. She knew. He exhaled, his breath misting in the cold. His hand trembled as he pulled one out. It was addressed to James Carter, the name hitting him like a fist. Carter had owned a factory that had burned down 10 years ago, a fire whispered about in corners but listed as accident. Thomas tore open the envelope. The paper stank of age and the same acrid smell. She knew the fire was no accident, and so do you. It read, the handwriting cramped and accusing. Signed again. She knew. He grabbed another. Elena Markov, the doctor who had examined the bodies. Then Peter Stone, the fireman who still shook when he drank. Each name linked to that fire, to that day when the sky turned red and the city swallowed its secrets. He closed his eyes, and the past came rushing out. 10 years ago, the factory had lit up the night, flames laughing at the hoses. 4 lives had burned in that inferno, the smoke thick as lies, and rumors hissed through the crowd. Someone set it on fire. Thomas had been there, on the edge, watching the chaos unfold. The official story had buried the whispers, but they never died. Eyes open, he shuffled through more letters. One had a photograph. A woman, sharp cheekbones, her gaze cutting through the grainy image. Familiar, maybe from that night or some bar later, but he couldn't remember. He turned it over. March 15th, 2015. A month before the fire. His heart pounded. Thomas sank down on the bench, the suitcase gaping at his feet like an open wound. He couldn't leave this. Not now. Not when it had awakened something alive in the gray shell he had become. He would find them, Carter, Elena, Stone, everyone. He would dig up what the fire had hidden, what this woman knew, her face a splinter in his mind. The silence grew teeth. Thomas slammed the suitcase shut and stepped onto the platform. The wind brought the smell of something wet, but the sky remained dry. The stars twinkled coldly and indifferently. There was truth out there somewhere. He would find it, even if he had to go through hell. The archives were a place where time stood still. Dust hung in the air like a perpetual fog, settling on. Shelves, boxes, and files that reached to the ceiling. Light barely filtered through the murky windows, and the lamps hanging on wires cast a dim, yellowish light that made everything look like an old photograph. The smell of old paper, ink, and damp permeated every corner. It was as silent as a crypt, broken only by the rustle of pages and the creaking of floorboards. Thomas Gray walked down the narrow aisle between the shelves, his footsteps echoing as if someone was following him. But he was alone, or so it seemed. He was looking for the fire file, the one that had swallowed a factory and 4 lives 10 years ago. The file that was whispered about, but no one dared to dig deeper. Thomas stopped at a shelf marked 2015. His fingers, rough with age, slid over the spines of the folders until he found the right one. Textile factory fire, April 15th, 2015. He pulled it out, dust rising in a cloud, making him cough. The file was thin, too thin for such a file. He sat down at his desk, turned on the desk lamp, and its light fell on the yellowed pages. The report was as dry as ash. Fire caused by electrical short circuit. 4 workers killed. Case closed. No mention of investigation, no witness statements, no expert opinions, just signatures sharp and confident as an axe blow. Thomas turned the page and froze. Several sheets had been torn out, the edges ragged, as if someone had been in a hurry to erase the marks. He ran his finger over the scraps of paper, feeling a chill creep up his spine. This was no accident. Someone had removed the truth, hidden it like a corpse in the woods. He stood up and walked over to the archivist's desk. The old man sat behind the desk, his face lined like a mask. He didn't look up as Thomas approached. "I need more material on the factory fire," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice even. The archivist slowly raised his head, his eyes sharp as needles. "No more," he said, his voice hoarse as a rusty lock. "Everything that was there is in the file." "But it's not all there," Thomas insisted. "Pages have been torn out. Someone has removed some of the documents." The old man chuckled, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Maybe they did. 10 years have passed. Things change." He leaned forward, his breath smelling of tobacco and something sour. "You're not the first to dig into this, but they all left empty-handed, or didn't leave at all." Thomas swallowed. "Who else was looking?" "I don't remember," the archivist shrugged. "People come and go, like shadows." He paused, then added more quietly, "But if you want to know more, find John Smith. He worked at the factory, quit the day before the fire. Maybe he knows something." "Where can I find him?" Thomas asked. "He lives on the outskirts, in an old house by the river. But be careful. He doesn't like guests." The archivist turned away, making it clear that the conversation was over. Thomas left the archive, feeling the cold, damp air outside rush into his lungs. He looked back. No one was following him, but the feeling of strange eyes did not go away. He got into the car, started the engine, and drove to the river. John Smith's house stood on the outskirts, surrounded by thickets and fog that spread over the water. He knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it opened. John was tall, stooped, with a face that resembled tree bark. "What do you want?" he muttered. "I'm looking for the truth about the fire," Thomas said. "What happened 10 years ago?" John chuckled, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "Really? She's gone. Everything burned." He went to close the door, but Thomas held it. "I found letters. They said she knew. Do you know who that is?" John froze, his hand shaking. "Come in," he said quietly. Inside, the house was dark, smelling of damp and tobacco. John sat down at the table, motioned to a chair. "She's Maria," he began, his voice low as the rumble of a river. "She worked at the factory, saw what happened. The fire wasn't an accident. Carter, the owner, set it himself for the insurance money. Maria knew, but she was kept quiet." "Who made you?" Thomas asked. "The ones at the top." John waved his hand. "Power, money, they decide everything." He pulled out an old photograph. Maria, the woman with the sharp cheekbones. "She disappeared after the fire. No one looked for her, and I quit because I didn't want to be next." Thomas looked at the photo, feeling the cold squeeze his chest. "Where is she now?" "I don't know." John shook his head. "Maybe she is, maybe she isn't. But if you're digging, be prepared. They don't like it when you stir up ashes." Thomas walked away, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. He got into his car but didn't start the engine. He watched the river, flowing slowly, like time, taking the truth away. He knew he was in something bigger than a case. This was a system where people were just pawns, but he couldn't stop. He would find Maria, or what was left of her. He would find the truth, even if it destroyed him. Night fell over the city like a pall. Thomas drove through the empty streets, feeling the shadows deepening. He knew he was being watched, but he wasn't afraid. Not yet. He didn't know yet that this was just the beginning. The abandoned house of a former factory worker stood on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a thick fog that hung over the river like a living thing. Thomas Gray drove up to it when night had already fallen on the town, and darkness had swallowed everything around. The house was old, with peeling paint and broken windows through which the wind howled like a wounded animal. Thomas got out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel, and he felt the cold penetrate to his bones. He knocked on the door, and after a long pause it opened. John Smith stood in the doorway, his face pale as a ghost, his eyes empty, like a man who had long since lost hope. "What do you want?" John asked, his voice as hoarse as a rusty lock. "I'm looking for the truth about the fire," Thomas replied, trying to sound confident, "about what happened 10 years ago." John chuckled, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "Really, she's gone. Everything burned." He went to close the door, but Thomas held it. "I found letters. They said she knew. Do you know who that is?" John froze, his hand shaking. "Come in," he said quietly. Inside, the house was dark, smelling of damp and tobacco. John sat down at the table, motioned to a chair. "She's Maria," he began, his voice low as the rumble of a river. "She worked at the factory, saw what happened. The fire wasn't an accident. Carter, the owner, set it himself for the insurance money. Maria knew, but she was kept quiet. "Who made you?" Thomas asked. "The ones at the top." John waved his hand. "Power, money, they decide everything." He pulled out an old photograph. Maria, the woman with the sharp cheekbones. She disappeared after the fire. No one looked for her, and I quit because I didn't want to be next. Thomas looked at the photo, feeling the cold squeeze his chest. "Where is she now?" "I don't know." John shook his head. "Maybe she is. Maybe she isn't. But if you're digging, be prepared. They don't like it when you stir up ashes." Thomas walked away, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. He got into his car, but didn't start the engine. He watched the river flowing slowly like time, taking the truth away. He knew he was in something bigger than a case. This was a system where people were just pawns, but he couldn't stop. He would find Maria, or what was left of her. He would find the truth even if it destroyed him. Night fell over the city like a pall. Thomas drove through the empty streets, feeling the shadows deepening. He knew he was being watched, but he wasn't afraid. Not yet. He didn't know yet that this was just the beginning. Night fell like a heavy blanket over the city, enveloping everything in impenetrable darkness. Thomas Gray drove through the empty streets, his car sliding on the wet asphalt, leaving a trail of spray in his wake. He was heading for an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, the place John Smith had mentioned. A warehouse that held unofficial documents that could shed light on the fire 10 years ago. Thomas knew it was dangerous, but there was no turning back. The truth beckoned to him like a light at the end of a tunnel, and he could not turn back. The warehouse stood alone, surrounded by thick undergrowth and a thick fog that hung over the land like a ghost of the past. Thomas parked the car in the shade, turned off the headlights, and got out. It was deathly quiet, except for the wind howling in the trees, as if mourning forgotten secrets. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the rusty warehouse door. The cold was bone-chilling, but Thomas pulled out a pick and set to work. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. It was pitch black inside. The flashlight beam picked out dusty boxes piled in the corner. Thomas began to examine them, his fingers shaking either from the cold or the strain. The boxes were labeled Factory 2015, Documents, Insurance. He opened one and dove into the papers, reports, letters, receipts, a chaotic archive of other people's sins. Among the papers, he came across a document signed by Carter. It spoke of insurance on the factory. The amount was astronomical, and the fire had made the owner a fortune. Thomas clutched the sheet in his hand, feeling his heart pound in his chest. This was it, proof of arson. He dug deeper and found a folder labeled Maria. Inside were her photographs, letters and notes, proving that she knew about the arson. Maria was the witness whose words were drowned in silence. Suddenly, the silence was broken by footsteps outside the door. Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat. The footsteps were approaching, heavy, confident, inexorable. He turned off the flashlight and ducked behind the boxes. The door swung open, and a man's silhouette appeared in the doorway. He entered, his movements sharp, like a predator sensing prey. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, trying to blend into the shadows. The stranger stopped at the box Thomas had just examined and began sorting through the papers. This was his chance. Thomas moved slowly toward the exit, but the treacherous floorboard creaked under his foot. The man turned around abruptly. Their gazes met, and Thomas saw icy emptiness in the stranger's eyes. "Who are you?" the man barked, his voice cutting like sandpaper. Thomas didn't answer. He lunged for the door, but the man was faster. An iron grip closed on his collar, and Thomas collapsed to the floor. His head hit the concrete, blood running hot down his temple. The man loomed over him, his face lost in shadow. "What are you doing here?" The voice was low and threatening. "I'm looking for the truth." Thomas squeezed out, his words trembling. "The truth?" The man grinned, baring his teeth. "The truth is a dangerous thing. It can kill." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. "I know the fire was arson. Carter burned the factory for insurance. Maria knew, and she was silenced." The man leaned closer, his breath sour on Thomas's face. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into. Give it up or you'll regret it." "I can't," Thomas replied. "I have to find Maria." The stranger straightened up, his eyes narrowed into slits. "Maria is dead, and you will be next if you don't stop." Fear squeezed Thomas's heart, but he still asked, "Who are you?" "The one who buries the truth," the man said, and turning around, disappeared into the darkness. Thomas rose slowly. His head was spinning, but he was alive. He gathered the documents and left the warehouse. The night enveloped him, black and sticky as tar. He felt other people's eyes on his back, but there was no turning back. Maria, alive or dead, was waiting for him. The truth was waiting for him, and he would find her, even if it meant the end of him. Rain pounded the tin roof of the warehouse as if someone were tapping out a code from above that Jack had never cracked. He clutched Lowry's notebook, tattered, its pages yellowed and saturated with the smell of damp and old blood. The last few days had blurred into an endless series of shadows and rustling sounds and faces he would rather forget. But he couldn't forget. He stood across from Director Harris, who sat at his desk, dimly lit, looking at Jack with the cool confidence of a man who knows the system always wins. His fingers tapped the tabletop, steady, rhythmic, like a metronome counting down, the final seconds before the inevitable. "You think this is the end?" Harris's voice was as dry as the autumn leaves underfoot. "Burn her. Rip her up. Throw her in the river. It won't change anything." Jack was silent. He already knew that the truth, torn from the darkness, would not destroy the web woven over the years. The list in the notebook, names, dates, disappearances, was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind every name was a story, behind every date a life, and behind it all, people like Harris, whose hands had never been directly stained with blood. He glanced at the page where the last entry was. Elizabeth Crow, 03/14/2019. The girl whose face he had seen in an old photograph in the school archives. Her eyes still stared at him from memory, empty but alive. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat and took out his lighter. "This isn't the end," he said finally, holding the flickering flame to the edge of the notebook. The paper caught quickly, the flame licking the names, turning them to ash. "This is just the beginning." Harris chuckled, but there was a shadow in his eyes, not fear, but something close to irritation. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and stepped toward the door. "You're nobody, Reynolds. A security guard with a hero complex. The world doesn't change because of people like you." The door slammed, and Jack was alone. The fire was dying down, leaving black flakes on the concrete floor. The rain continued to pound, drowning out the sound of his breathing. He knew Harris was right. The system would not collapse on one man. The secret society Lowry had started had not disappeared. It was merely lurking, like an animal in the shadows, waiting to strike again. But Jack made his choice. He stepped outside, letting the cold drops fall on his face. Ash settled on his boots, mixing with the dirt. Somewhere out there in the city, there were those who knew the truth and those who hid it. And though the notebook had burned, its shadow remained with him, heavy as a wet cloak that he would never take off. He walked away, disappearing into the gray haze of the streets. Behind him, the school stood like a silent mass, guarding its secrets. The story was not over. It never ends.